My name is Jolene Whitaker. I'm 38 years old, and the last time I saw my ex-husband, he was sitting across from me in a chair I had chosen, in a room I had built, with his hands folded on his knees the way men fold their hands when they are trying very hard to look like they are not afraid. He had come to ask me for a job. He didn't know it was my company. I want you to sit with that for a second before I explain anything else. Because there is no version of this story that I could have predicted, and there is no version of this story that I would change. Not the marriage, not the leaving, not the moment he knocked on that door and I looked up from my desk and watched 9 years rearrange themselves on his face in about 4 seconds. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, because none of this makes sense without the beginning. I grew up in Knoxville, Tennessee, in a house where the heat sometimes worked and the love always did. My mother worked double shifts at a textile plant on the east side, 5 in the morning until 2, then back again at 4. And she did it alone after my father left when I was 6, which is something she never complained about and something I never forgot. We didn't have money. We had a kitchen that smelled like coffee and clean dish towels, a front porch that tilted slightly to the left, and a mother who read aloud after dinner because she said stories were free. I didn't know we were short on money until a girl at school said something about my shoes when I was 9. I went home and looked at my shoes for a long time. Then I put them back on and kept wearing them until they fell apart, because my mother had bought them, and that made them fine. What I learned in that house was that you don't complain and you don't explain. You figure it out. You make something from whatever is in front of you. You do not wait for someone to hand you a floor plan. You build the floor yourself. And if you have ever been made to feel like the things you built quietly, without applause, were somehow less real than the things people built loudly with other people's money, I think you already understand what I'm about to tell you. If this is resonating, go ahead and hit like, subscribe so you don't miss how this ends, and share it with someone who needs to hear this story. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I genuinely want to know. Now let me keep going. I got a full academic scholarship to the University of Tennessee when I was 17. Double major, finance and computer science. I worked weekends at a copy shop to cover my books, and I ate peanut butter sandwiches more days than not, and I graduated summa cum laude at 21. Then I got a merit fellowship to Northwestern for my MBA, which meant I spent 2 years in Chicago in a city that didn't know my name, and I fell in love with it. The pace, the gray winters, the way the lake looks when the light is low and cold and the city is just waking up. I stayed. I got a job at a mid-sized advisory firm, learned everything worth learning in 3 years, and then left. I was 26. I had $40,000 I had saved in 4 years of working 2 jobs simultaneously, a second bedroom in a Wicker Park apartment, and a business idea I had been refining on legal pads since graduate school. I registered the company on a Thursday. I made my first client call on a Friday. I did not sleep a full night for 3 years. By the time I was 32, Whitaker Capital Solutions had 22 employees and 2 floors of office space in the West Loop. By the time I was 35, we had 74 employees and a client roster I am not permitted to disclose, but that would surprise you. I did not come from money. I did not have a family connection or a safety net. I had a mother in Tennessee who read stories aloud, and a brother who called every Sunday, and a legal pad full of ideas I refused to let go of. Nobody celebrated any of this. I want to be careful about what I mean by that. I had people. I had Renata, who joined the company in year 2 after walking out of a firm that promoted a man she had personally trained, and who has been my VP of operations ever since. She celebrated. She keeps a bottle of champagne in her desk drawer for the occasions she deems worth it, and she has opened it more times than I can count. But from my family, the people who should have been watching, nothing. My mother called every week. My brother called every Sunday. The rest? Silence. Or something worse than silence. There were cousins who made comments at Thanksgiving about the hours I kept, An aunt who said more than once that a woman who worked that hard was going to end up alone. A particular kind of quiet that happens when you outgrow the story people have decided you belong in, and they would rather not revise their version of you. I met Marcus at a dinner party when I was 29. He was charming and smart and said things that sounded real. He asked me about my work on the first night we met and actually listened to the answer, which was rarer than it sounds. I was 3 years into building the company, and I was running on caffeine and conviction, and I had not, in a long time, let anyone just sit across from me and pay attention. We got married when I was 30. We had 9 years together. He knew I ran a company. He knew I worked long hours and had employees who depended on me, and that I kept my business accounts separate from our household accounts, which was just sensible. What he didn't know, what he never asked and I never offered, was exactly what the company was worth. Not because I was hiding it, because money in my family's house was not a thing you discussed, and I had never unlearned that. I paid my half of everything, always. When we bought the condo in Lincoln Park, I paid half. When we went to Italy for our 5th anniversary, I paid half. I was not hiding anything. I was just quiet about it. The way I have always been quiet about the things I am most certain of. He left on a Wednesday in February. I was on a client call in my home office. The note was on the kitchen counter. It said he needed more momentum. It said they had grown in different directions. It said Vivian understood the world he wanted to live in. Vivian Ashford. Her father's name was on 3 buildings within 4 blocks of my office. I finished the call. I sat in the kitchen for a long time. Then I called my lawyer and started the paperwork, and I let Marcus take the furniture, and I went back to work. That is not a performance of strength. That is what happens when you have been building something real for so long that losing something false is clarifying. It hurts. I am not going to pretend it didn't hurt, but the hurt had a shape I recognized. It felt like the moment I looked at my shoes when I was 9. Painful and then informative. 8 months later, on a Tuesday in October, Renata Cruz walked into my corner office and set a manila folder on my desk without saying anything at all. I turned around from the window. I picked up the folder. I read the name on the cover sheet, and then I set it back down, very gently, and looked at Renata Cruz and said, "When is the interview scheduled?" Renata said Thursday, 11 o'clock, panel of 3. I said, "Don't change anything." She stood there for a moment in the doorway with her ceramic travel mug and her high bun and the 2 pencils she always has tucked into it. And she looked at me the way she looks at things she is still deciding whether to say out loud. Then she nodded once and left, and I turned back to the window, and the lake was gray, and the city was doing what it always does in October, pulling its collar up and getting on with it. I thought about Marcus for exactly as long as it took me to recognize the feeling. Then I put it down and went back to my afternoon. But you want to know what the silence felt like after she closed the door? I'll tell you. It wasn't peaceful. Silence never is, not the kind that comes after something lands. It was full, the way a room is full after everyone has left it. All the shapes of things still present, just no longer moving. I sat at my desk and I looked at the folder, and I did not open it again, because I didn't need to. I had read the name. That was enough information for one afternoon. What I did not know yet, sitting there on that Tuesday in October, was how long Marcus had been struggling. I found out later, the way you find out most things you didn't ask to know, through the administrative details of the process. His consulting contract had ended 3 months before he applied. He had been quietly job searching for 4 months without telling Vivian, who believed, as far as I could gather, that he was between projects in the deliberate and intentional way that consultants sometimes are. He had $11,000 in a personal savings account. He was wearing cufflinks she had bought him. I keep thinking about what it means to spend 9 years next to someone and still not know the architecture of their fear. To share a bed, a kitchen, a city, and to have the shape of who they actually are remain somehow just out of focus. I don't say that with bitterness. I say it because it's true, and because I think some of you know exactly what that feels like. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly in the comments. Have you ever looked at someone you thought you knew completely and realized the version of them you loved was partly a story you had told yourself? Drop it below. I read every single one, and I mean that. Marcus had not looked closely at the company when he applied. I know this because the application process was handled entirely by Renata's team, and the company name in the job listing was listed as WCS Advisory Group, a doing business as name we had used for a consulting subdivision since year 4. The full legal name, Whitaker Capital Solutions, was on the lease, on the contracts, on the letterhead in my office. It was not hidden. It was simply not something he had thought to search for. The name Whitaker apparently had not given him pause. It is a common enough name. He had told himself it was a coincidence and kept going, because that is what you do when you need a job and you are running out of time and the woman in the penthouse is starting to ask questions you don't have good answers to. I understand the logic of that. I am not without empathy for it. Fear makes people move forward when they should stop and look. I know that feeling. I have felt it. The difference between Marcus and me is that when I was afraid of failing at something I had built. He was afraid of being seen as something he wasn't. The life I had built after he left was not a performance of recovery. I want to be clear about that, because I have heard the word resilience used to describe women in situations like mine, and it always sounds like a consolation prize. I was not resilient. I was already myself. He left, and I returned, fully, without ceremony, to the person I had been building since I was a girl in Knoxville, watching my mother get passed over by someone half as qualified. My mornings looked like this: 5:45, coffee, 40 minutes of reading before the city got loud. Then the commute, 6 blocks on foot, past the Ethiopian restaurant that had been there since before the neighborhood changed, past the parking garage where the attendant knew my name and my order from the coffee cart 2 doors down. Into the building, 14th floor, the particular quiet of a company doing good work. My evenings looked like this: home by 7 most nights. Dinner, I had learned to cook properly in the years when ordering in felt like waste. A call with my mother on Wednesdays, a call with my brother on Sundays. Renata and I had dinner once a month at a Thai place on Randolph where we had been going since year 2 and where they still seated us at the same corner table without asking. I had almost gone back once. Not to Marcus. That door had closed the moment I read the note. But to smallness. To the version of myself that stayed quiet in rooms where she should have spoken. About 4 months after the divorce was finalized, I was in a meeting with a potential investor. Older, old money, the kind of man who calls you sweetheart without registering that he's done it. And he said something about the company that was just slightly, precisely wrong. And I felt the old pull, the reflex. Smile and correct him gently and make it easy for him. I did not do that. I corrected him directly and without apology and watched him recalibrate. And afterward, in the elevator, Renata said nothing, just handed me a coffee and pressed the lobby button. That was enough. The folder arrived on a Tuesday. I sat with it until Wednesday evening, when I finally opened it again and read the full application. Cover letter, resume, references. He had written the cover letter carefully. You could tell he had worked on it. There was a line about his passion for building relationships in complex stakeholder environments that I read twice, not because it was good, but because I recognized the effort in it. And the effort made him briefly real again in a way I had mostly stopped letting him be. His resume was solid, genuine experience, good instincts documented across 10 years of consulting work. On paper, He was a plausible candidate. That was the uncomfortable truth I had to sit with for a full day. That his application was not without merit. That if his name had been anything other than his name, the process might have surfaced him to the final round on the numbers alone. I thought about what Renata had said when she first put the folder on my desk. Not the words, she hadn't used many, but the decision embedded in bringing it to me at all. She could have flagged it internally and quietly moved him to a different pipeline. She could have made the call herself and spared me the folder. She didn't. She brought it to me, set it down, and waited to see what I would do with it. That is what it looks like when someone trusts you completely. Not when they protect you from the information. When they put the information in your hands and step back. I closed the folder on Wednesday night. I put it on the left side of my desk, which is where I put things that have been decided. And I went home and I cooked dinner. Pasta, nothing complicated. And I ate it at the kitchen table with the window open and the October air coming in cold and clean. And I thought about a girl in Knoxville who looked at her worn-out shoes and decided they were fine. Thursday was clear and cold. I was in my office by 7. I had 3 calls before 10, all of them easy, all of them the ordinary machinery of a company that knew what it was doing. At 10:50, I heard the elevator. I did not look at my door. I waited. I finished the paragraph I was reading in the document in front of me. At 11, Renata appeared in the hallway outside my door and gave me a look that communicated nothing except that everything was running exactly as it was designed to run. I nodded. I waited 5 more minutes. Then I picked up my legal pad, uncapped my pen, and walked to the end of the hall. The door to the conference room at the end of the hall has a small window set into it, frosted glass so you can see light and shape but not detail. I had chosen that glass deliberately when we renovated because I wanted people inside to feel contained, not observed. I stood outside it for a moment, not hesitating, just arriving. There is a difference. I opened the door. Marcus was already seated. He was in a navy suit and his hair had been recently cut, and he was holding a copy of his own resume in both hands, the way people hold things when they need something to do with their hands. He was looking at the table when I came in. He looked up. I watched it happen. The moment of recognition is not like what you see in movies. It is not a gasp or a recoil. It is quieter than that and more devastating. It moved across his face in layers. First, the polite interview smile beginning to form, then the confusion, then the specific stillness of a person who has just understood something large and irreversible. 4 seconds, maybe 5. The resume in his hands didn't move. "Hello, Marcus," I said. My voice was the voice I use in boardrooms, even, professional, a voice I had spent years building on purpose, because I had started out with a voice that shook when I was nervous, and I had decided, at 24, in a conference room where no one looked at me when I spoke, that I would never again give a room the satisfaction of hearing me uncertain. He came in and sat down across from me, because what else was there to do? The interview was scheduled. The process was running. He sat down. I asked him about his experience in stakeholder relationship management. He answered. His voice was slightly lower than usual, and he cleared his throat once at the beginning and then controlled it, and I gave him credit for that. I asked about his approach to business development in a mid-market private equity environment. He answered that too, thoughtfully actually. The answers were good. That was the thing I had prepared myself for and still found difficult. That he was good at this. That the decade of work on his resume was real, whatever else was not. I took one note on my legal pad. I did not look at him more than was professionally appropriate. I did not look at him less. At the end, I said, "Thank you for coming in. We'll be in touch within the week." I stood and extended my hand. He shook it. His hand was cold. He said, and this was the only moment he stepped outside the frame of the interview. He said very quietly as he was releasing my hand, "Jolene." Just my name, nothing attached to it. No question, no explanation. Just the word, offered like something he didn't know what to do with. I met his eyes for the first time in the conversation. "The team will follow up by Friday," I said, and I walked out. I have been asked, by Renata, by my brother, by myself at 3 in the morning, what I felt in that hallway after the door closed behind me. And the honest answer is that I felt tired. Not sad, not triumphant. Tired. The way you feel at the end of something that has been longer and heavier than you fully admitted while you were carrying it. There is a kind of exhaustion that only arrives when you finally put something down, and you feel the weight of it only in its absence. If that kind of tired has ever found you, the tired that means something is finally over, you already know there are no words that quite fit it. Hit like and subscribe so you're here when I tell you what came next. Because what came next is the part that changed me. I went back to my office. I sat down. I looked at the lake for a long time. Then I opened the candidate assessment folder, the formal one, the one Patricia from HR had compiled with input from Renata and James from strategy. And I read Marcus's evaluation. Scoring criteria: stakeholder management, business development track record, cultural alignment, leadership potential, conflict of interest flags. He had scored well, genuinely well. In a different universe, he was in the final two. The conflict of interest flag was real. His previous firm had active relationships with two of our current clients. It was the kind of flag that, for a director-level hire, required serious consideration. It was also the kind of flag that, in practice, could be managed with the right disclosure protocols. It was not automatically disqualifying. It was a judgment call. I held the pen over the assessment form for a long time. I thought about my mother at the textile plant, passed over by someone less qualified because he presented better. I thought about the note on the kitchen counter in February. I thought about the word momentum and what it costs a person to believe that the life beside them doesn't have enough of it. I thought about the girl who looked at her worn-out shoes and kept wearing them anyway, because her mother had bought them and that made them fine. And then I thought, this is not about any of that. That is the thought I want you to understand, because it is the only thought in this entire story that I am genuinely proud of. Not the company, not the office, not the moment his face rearranged itself when he understood where he was. This thought. This is not about any of that. I wrote one line in the margin of the assessment form. Recommend second candidate. Conflict of interest. Existing client relationships present structural risk at director level. It was a real flag. It was also a flag I might have navigated differently for a different candidate. I knew that. I wrote it anyway, because the alternative, giving him the role to prove I was above it, was just another kind of decision made about Marcus, and I was finished making decisions about Marcus. I was not punishing him. I was not saving him. I was running my company. I signed the form and put it in the outgoing tray, and I sat back in my chair, and the afternoon light was coming through the west-facing windows at a low angle that turned everything in the room the color of old honey. And I felt, for the first time in a long time, like the exact right size. Not large, not small. Exactly the size I was, in exactly the space I had built, making exactly the decision I could live with. Renata knocked on the open door at 4:15. She came in and sat in the chair across from my desk, the same chair Marcus had sat in 8 months ago when he told me he needed more momentum. And she looked at the outgoing tray and then at me. She didn't say anything. I said, "Standard process. Patricia sends the letter." Renata nodded. Then she reached into the pocket of her burgundy wrap dress and produced a small bottle of champagne. Not a full bottle, one of those single-serve bottles they sell at airport kiosks, and set it on my desk. I looked at it. "That's not for the decision," she said. "That's for the last 8 months." I looked at her for a moment. Then I laughed, a real one, the kind that starts somewhere in the chest and moves up without asking permission. And it was the first time I had laughed like that since February. And it lasted maybe 10 seconds, and then it was gone, and the office was quiet again, and the light was still that color of old honey, and Renata was still sitting there across from me, and everything was exactly as it should be. I thought about Marcus in the elevator going down, the math he must have been doing, the name on the building, the 14th floor, the staff who knew each other and moved through the space with the ease of people who trusted the place they worked. I thought about him going back to the Gold Coast penthouse and sitting with the information that the woman he had left, for not having enough momentum, had built something worth 37 floors of someone else's ambition. And I understood, finally, that he had not left me because I was small. He had left me because I was quiet about being large. And that was not a flaw I needed to correct. That was a feature of who I am. I had built the whole thing in the space between other people's assumptions. Being underestimated, I realized, is not a wound. It is a room where you can work without interruption. The rejection letter went out on a Friday morning. Standard format, Patricia's signature, the same letter that goes to every candidate who reaches the final stage and does not move forward. Professionally worded, specific enough to be respectful, general enough to be clean. It arrived in Marcus's inbox at 9:14 in the morning, and I know the exact time because Renata, who monitors outgoing HR communications as part of her role, mentioned it to me in passing. Not with satisfaction, just as information, the way she handles most things. I was on a call with a client in Seattle when it went out. I did not check the time. I did not wait for it. I had signed the form, put it in the outgoing tray, and moved on, which is the only way I know how to do anything that matters. He called that afternoon. My cell phone, not the office line. The number he had had for 9 years. The number I had never changed because changing it felt like a performance of moving on, rather than the actual thing. I watched the screen light up with his name. I let it ring. I let it go to voicemail. The voicemail was 3 minutes and 14 seconds long, which I know because the notification showed the duration before I had decided whether to listen to it. I listened to it once, 2 days later, on a Sunday morning before my brother called. It was not what I expected. There was no anger in it, no accusation. It was a man trying to find words for a situation that did not have a clean vocabulary yet. He said he hadn't known. He said he understood if I never responded. He said, and this was the part that stayed with me, the part I have turned over more than once since. He said, I think I didn't look closely enough at a lot of things. I think I told myself a story, and I didn't check whether it was true. That is more self-awareness than I had expected from him. I sat with that. I gave it its due weight. Then I put my phone in my bag and went to make coffee and waited for my brother to call. And when he called, I told him the whole thing, start to finish. And he was quiet for a long time. And then he said, Joe, you know what Mom would say. And I said, I know. And we both sat there for a moment with that, and it was enough. What happened to Marcus after that arrived to me in pieces, through the ordinary channels of a city where certain circles overlap, whether you plan them to or not. Renata heard things from her husband, who worked in commercial real estate, and knew people who knew people. A mutual acquaintance from the consulting world mentioned something at an industry lunch she attended without me. My lawyer, who had handled the divorce, called once about an unrelated matter and mentioned, briefly, that she had heard Marcus had relocated. He and Vivian did not last the winter. I don't know the details, and I did not ask for them, because they were not mine to have. What I understood, from the edges of what people said and didn't say, was that the version of himself he had presented to her had required a level of maintenance he could not sustain once the income stopped. That is not a cruel thing to say. It is just what happens when you build yourself around an image rather than a foundation. The image is load-bearing until it isn't, and then everything above it has to find somewhere else to stand. I did not feel satisfaction when I heard this. I want to be honest about that, because I think there is an expectation in stories like mine that the protagonist feels vindicated when the antagonist falls, and the feeling should be clean and bright and final. It wasn't any of those things. What I felt was something closer to recognition. The particular sadness of watching someone else confirm what you already knew, that the story they were telling was always going to run out of road. I called my mother that week. Not about Marcus. I almost never talked to her about Marcus, because she had liked him and I hadn't wanted to make her feel complicit in something she hadn't caused. I called her because I wanted to hear her voice, and because the house she lives in Maryville is warm in November, and I knew she would have the heat on and the radio playing in the kitchen, and that the particular sound of that, radio, heat, her voice, was something I needed without being able to fully explain why. She asked how work was going. I told her we were closing an acquisition before end of quarter. She said, "I don't always understand what that means, but I know it means you did something hard and it worked." I said, "That's exactly what it means." She said, "Good girl." She has been saying that since I was 6 years old, and it has never once felt diminishing. From her it means, "I see you. I have always seen you." Renata and I had dinner at the Thai place on Randolph in the second week of November. The corner table. The same order we have been getting since year 2. At some point in the middle of the meal, she put down her fork and looked at me and said, "Can I ask you something?" I said yes. She said, "Are you okay?" Actually okay, not professionally okay. And I thought about it, genuinely thought about it, the way she deserved. And I said, "I think I am becoming okay in a way that's going to be more permanent than the last version." She picked her fork back up. "Good," she said, "because I need you present for this acquisition, and I can't have you being emotionally interesting right now." I laughed again, the chest kind. There were people who came back. A cousin who had made the shoe comment when I was 9. She was 41 now, and she called on a weeknight, and she didn't quite apologize, but she said, "I've been thinking about how we treated you when you were coming up. I don't think we were fair." That was specific enough. I did not need a speech. I needed someone to name the thing clearly, and she had named it. And so I said, "Thank you for saying that." And I meant it, and we moved on. There were people who didn't come back. I accepted that too, without ceremony, without the performed forgiveness that requires an audience. Some distances become permanent, not because of a single decision, but because of the accumulation of small ones. And by the time either person looks up, the ground between them has changed into something neither of them knows how to cross anymore. I don't carry bitterness about those people. I carry the fact of them, which is different. In December, I wrote a letter, not to Marcus. I had nothing left to say to Marcus that needed to be said in writing. I wrote it to myself, which sounds like something a therapist assigns, and is, in fact, something my therapist had suggested 18 months earlier, and that I had resisted until I wasn't resisting anymore. I wrote it on a Sunday morning at my kitchen table, with the window cracked and the city doing its December thing outside. Gray sky, bare trees, the particular quality of light that makes Chicago look like a photograph of itself. I wrote about the shoes. I wrote about the copy shop and the legal pad and the $40,000 and the second bedroom in Wicker Park. I wrote about the note on the kitchen counter and the client call I finished before I let myself feel anything. I wrote about the folder on my desk and the 4 seconds on a man's face and the one line I wrote in the margin of a form. And then I wrote this, which is the truest thing I have found at the end of all of it. Being unseen is not the same as being small. It just means you are working in a room where no one thought to look. And when you build something real in a room like that, something that holds weight, that employs people, that outlasts the assumptions of everyone who underestimated you, the building itself becomes the answer. You don't have to explain it. You just have to unlock the door. I read it to Renata over the phone that evening. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm putting that on the wall in my office." I told her she absolutely was not. She absolutely did. My name is Jolene Whitaker. I am 38 years old, and on a Tuesday morning in January, 4 months after a man I used to love sat across from me in a chair I had chosen, and shook my hand, and rode the elevator down 14 floors into a version of the story he had not written. I walked 6 blocks through a city that knew my name, took the elevator to the 14th floor, and sat down at my desk in front of a window where the lake was, for the first time in months, completely still. The light was low and clean. Renata was already in the building. I could hear the particular rhythm of her moving through the office, the way you learn to recognize the people who matter by the sound they make in a space. I had a board meeting at 9, an acquisition to close before the end of the quarter, a call with my brother on Sunday, dinner with my mother in Maryville, where the house was warm and the radio played in the kitchen, and she still read actual books with actual light. I opened my laptop, I uncapped my pen, I went to work. And I want to ask you something before you go, because this story has been sitting in me for a long time, and sharing it with you matters more than I can say in a clean sentence. Has anyone ever underestimated you so completely that you built something in the space they left behind? Something they never saw coming? Something that became the truest version of you? Leave it in the comments. Tell me the whole thing if you want, or just one sentence. I read every single one, and I mean that, and I will be looking for yours. If this story stayed with you, if Jolene's story felt like something you needed to hear today, hit that like button, subscribe so you're here for every story that comes next, and share this with someone who is quietly building something in a room where no one is looking yet. They need to know it counts. It always counted.